Welcome to e-learning. So this is going to be a little bit different and strange as I'm wandering around my house and filming myself and making a wee video. The first theme we're going to go through is the Great Depression. I will get that posted here shortly, and I'll give you some directions on how we're going to do this for the rest of the semester, or quarter, I should say, fourth quarter. So, I don't know. We'll see how this thing goes. If you have suggestions, feel free to let me know. Make sure, even though we're doing e-learning, that you're continuing to stay active. Don't be like this guy right here. He pretty much just lays around the house all day. So, stay active. I will probably put in like 3 breaks in here. We're going to go ahead and get started with Chapter 33, The Great Depression and the New Deal. This will be in our Great Depression folder. We're not necessarily going to be following chapters anymore. So I'll just record myself going through the notes. You can feel free to write things down if you want. This should help you answer the discussion question. This should probably... You should break this up into at least 3 parts, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and maybe a little bit on Thursday as well. The discussion question will be due at midnight on Friday, and it will be the same as they have been in the past. You'll get a question, you answer it, and then you respond to somebody else's as well. So the response will take place, I suppose after it's due. I'll figure that one out and let you know. All right, here we go. Causes of the stock market crash. I linked a little video here. I'm going to go ahead and play that real quick. It takes about 10 minutes. I'll make a few comments as the video is going. So what's happening is these people are coming into the stock market and they don't really do any investigating into the company or how well the company is doing. They're just buying up shares. And as people hear that they're buying the shares, then that drives demand. And so then they sell off their shares and they're essentially artificially inflating the market. And they're making tons of money. And ultimately, in the end, it's going to come crashing down. All right. Here comes crashing down. Herbert Hoover is probably the most unpopular president. Not really his fault. It's a lot to do with the fact that nobody really knew how to get out of the Depression. And so once the market crashed and inflation skyrocketed and unemployment skyrocketed and everybody was looking for help, and ultimately the government, and Herbert Hoover has a great quote where he says, America will pull itself up by its bootstraps. And that really wasn't what America wanted to hear. Right? They wanted some sort of help. Nobody really knew what to do. Even FDR didn't know what to do, but he's going to promise help, and he's going to try a whole bunch of things. And those things will be called the New Deal, and then ultimately the second New Deal. FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was very active in her husband's political career. She was loved by the liberals and hated by the conservatives. There's plenty of people who consider her the first lady in the aspect that she's not just hosting parties, she is doing tons of stuff for the Democratic Party. And she's a very good public speaker, and she will really push through or help push through a lot of FDR's programs. Democrats called for a balanced budget and social and economic reforms. They're going to move away from the balanced budget, and ultimately they're going to adopt a policy of deficit spending. And we'll talk about that as it comes up. FDR was afflicted with infantile paralysis, which contributed to the most of his development of compassion and strength of will. All right. There's some speculation whether he didn't actually have polio, but a lot of people thought early on that he had polio. It might have been something slightly different than that, but essentially had the same effect. Most of his time was spent in a wheelchair, but he could walk with the help of braces. There's a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt. She's meeting with some coal miners. All right, during the election, FDR attacked the Republican Old Deal and supported a New Deal for the forgotten man. So he's kind of ripping on the Republican way there and calling it the Old Deal. And that's where he coins the phrase the New Deal, and that will be the name of FDR's programs. Americans are going to distrust the Republican Party because of the dire economic state of the country, the Great Depression. Again, Herbert Hoover is going to take the blame. It's not really entirely his fault. It was just the way business had been done and the way government had been run for the previous, 8 to 10 years during the 1920s that contributed mostly to this overinflation of goods. All right, this is a picture of the New Yorker magazine, the FDR in the front there. Roosevelt wins the election of 32 by a sweeping majority. Again, the economy is in crisis. Pretty difficult for a standing president to win an election when the economy is so bad. So he wins both the popular vote and the electoral college vote, and it'll be the first of his 4 wins. In the election of 1932, blacks became a vital part of the Democratic Party, especially in the urban centers of the North. That's a result of the Great Migration, and the Second Great Migration, which will take place a little bit later on, of African Americans moving out of the sharecropping system in the South and moving into the factories in the North, which we talked about during World War I. All right, the 3 R's. These are going to be huge in the New Deal. Relief, recovery, and reform. All right, those are important to remember. Roosevelt declared a national banking holiday. The problem was, once people started to lose money, they began to go to the bank to try to get money out. And banks make money by loaning your money. And one of the problems that many banks kind of succumbed to during this time is they were willing to loan people money to buy stock, and they used the stock as collateral. So if you couldn't pay back your money to the bank, then they took the stock that you had bought. Well, when the stock market crashes, those stocks are virtually worthless, meaning that money that people had put in the bank was now gone, and there was no federal protection. So if you had money in a savings account and your bank had loaned money to people to invest in the stock market, and the market crashed and those people lost the money, the bank lost your savings account. So even if you did nothing with the stock market, you still lost your money. And this made a huge run on the banks. And people were running to the banks to take their money out. And banks are only required to hold a certain percentage of the money that's actually deposited there, because that's how banks make money, is they loan it out and charge interest. And so when everybody went to the bank to get their money, the first handful of people got their money and everybody else got nothing. And so there's a huge panic all across the nation of people going to the banks to get their money out. And so Roosevelt closes them all down to stop that. It was one of the first things he did. This becomes known then as the 100 Days Congress or Emergency Congress, and it takes place from March 9th to June 16th. It passed a flood of legislation to help improve the state of the country. This sets the standard. Many presidents are now judged on their first 100 days as far as like what they do when they come into office. and he was really busy. The bank holiday is going to help. It's going to stop people from trying to pull all their money out and keep banks functioning within the economy. A lot of Great Depression era people never trust banks. They'll never trust them again. And so Roosevelt has to try to fix that, and he will. And we'll talk about that in some of the New Deal programs. All right, definition of relief, recovery, and reform there on the bottom. Short-range goals were relief and immediate recovery. Long-range goals were to create reform so it doesn't happen again. So we'll take a look at those as we go. Some of the New Deal programs gave the president unprecedented powers. Later on, these powers are going to be challenged, by the way. Many of the programs that gave the president this authority were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And as a result, Roosevelt is going to try to pack the court. And he will even come up with the idea of adding more Supreme Court justices so he can get more people that are thinking the same way he does. Ultimately, that fails, and that's probably a good thing because it would have, essentially eliminated one part of checks and balances. Congress gave President Roosevelt extraordinary blank check powers, which was an unprecedented level of support. Virtually anything he asked for, he got. Right? That doesn't happen very often. The New Deal legislation embraced progressive ideas. All right, some of these things, obviously, we see still in effect today. Unemployment insurance, old age insurance, that will become Social Security, minimum wage regulations, conservation and the development of natural resources, and restrictions on child labor. All right, it's kind of interesting. It's just a picture of a guy who lost his job. Work is what I want and not charity. Who will help me get a job? 7.5 years in Detroit, no money, sent away, furnish, best of references. And there he had his phone number there. And I think what's interesting is when you see a lot of these people holding signs for wanting jobs or whatever, is they're wearing shirts and ties. These were people that, prior to the stock market crash, had been doing fairly well for themselves. This is just a chart that goes through some of the different things that FDR did. And so we'll break those down and go through those in a little bit more detail as we go through here. Roosevelt manages the money. The Emergency Banking Relief Act of 1933 gave the president power to regulate banking transactions and foreign exchange and to reopen solvent banks. Solvent means they have enough money on hand to function. Okay, so you'll hear sometimes banks are declared insolvent. It essentially means they've run out of money. President Roosevelt will give fireside chats, which he talks over the radio, to soothe the public's confidence in banks. Again, trying to restore confidence in banks. Banks are very important to the economy because they keep money flowing through the economy. It goes in a circular pattern then, and obviously if it goes in a circular pattern, it means the money eventually comes back to you. So it was very important to keep banks functioning. Sometimes banks probably get away with bad investments because the government is often forced to bail them out because we need them so much. I also think that kind of topical right now with President Roosevelt giving fireside chats to talk to people and try to calm them down. We see that happening all across the country now, considering the current situation we're in. Governor Walz talks on TV, once or twice, maybe even 3 times a week as things are coming up. And it's one of the things that Roosevelt showed soothed the public's confidence. Congress is going to create the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act. The FDIC still exists today, insured individual bank deposits up to $5,000. Today, it's like $125,000. So today, if your bank closes down and you have $100,000 in your savings account, then the federal government will write you a check for $100,000. And so this was meant to try to restore confidence and to get people to continue to use banks. Roosevelt took the nation off the gold standard. We've talked about that a few times, being on the gold standard and off the gold standard. Essentially, what this means is that transactions in paper money are certainly going to be accepted, and now we're going to go off the perceived value. All right, and the perceived value of money in this country will be reflected by how much gold people think we have and how strong our economy is. One of FDR's goals was to create modest inflation, and this would relieve debtors' burdens and stimulate new production. Right? Inflation was achieved by buying gold at increasing prices over time, and this policy increased the amount of dollars in circulation, attempting to get money flowing through the economy again. That's a picture of Roosevelt driving around. Oftentimes he'll be in a car. Obviously, he struggled with walking and moving around. And so many times you'll see pictures of him in a car. He didn't like people to know that he had to walk with braces on his legs. All right, so this is a chart that talks about the number of bank closings. So you can see how dramatically it went up and then how quickly it stops. Creating jobs for the jobless. FDR created jobs with federal money to jumpstart the economy. The numerous programs here, like I stated earlier, some of them are going to be declared unconstitutional and therefore will be stopped. Some of them will last for quite a while. Some will actually end when the war starts. So we'll just talk about a few of them. The CCC was a pretty popular one. They employed about 3 million, mostly young men, kind of military-aged males. In government camps, their work included reforestation, firefighting, flood control, and swamp drainage. If you head to northern Minnesota, you'll see a lot of the work that was done by the CCC. A lot of our national parks up there, the ranger stations, the trails, cabins, they were all built by the CCC. The Federal Emergency Relief Act was Congress's first major effort to deal with the massive unemployment. It created the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which gave states direct relief payments or money for wages on work projects. And that's going to lead to the development of what's known as public works projects or public works administration. So there's a wide variety of different things that are going to be done there. And we'll see some examples of a few of those too. Civil Works Administration was a branch of FARA designed to provide temporary jobs during the winter emergency. Thousands of unemployed were employed at leaf raking and other manual labor jobs. Obviously, here in the state of Minnesota, that would include shoveling snow, plowing snow, things like that. Relief was given to farmers with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, making available millions of dollars through taxing the processors of farm products to help farmers meet their mortgages. This one will ultimately be ruled unconstitutional later on because they were taxing the processors of farm products. Farmers are given what you would consider relief payments or subsidies in order to stay competitive on the job market, and that still exists today. It was just the taxing mechanism that they used by taxing processors of farm products that was declared unconstitutional. And then we have the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and that assisted many households that had trouble paying for their mortgages. All these things were an effort to try to keep people in their homes. Even the Agricultural Adjustment Act was an effort to try to keep farmers farming. And without it, many of them were going bankrupt. And we'll see what happens when farmers go bankrupt and the land goes barren. All right, so we see some of the work of the Civilian Conservation Corps. You're going to see men going around, and again, like I said, working in national parks and doing various things like that. Some later major New Deal measures will be part of the second New Deal as well, from 33 to 39. All right, not everybody was on board with FDR's policies. So unemployment continued to plague the nation. Father Charles Coughlin, who preached anti-New Deal speeches over the radio, and Senator Huey P. Long publicized his Share Our Wealth program, in which every family in the United States would receive $5,000. That's pretty attractive to people. And Dr. Francis E. Townsend attracted millions of senior citizens with his plan that each citizen over the age of 60 would receive $200 a month. And that part will be adopted, and that will eventually kind of morph into Social Security. The rest of these guys, Huey Long is actually going to be assassinated later on. And the problem with giving everybody $5,000 was that it had created too much inflation. And so that really isn't a viable option either. Congress will pass the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, in 1935 with the objective of providing employment for useful projects, construction of buildings, roads, etc. Many of these are public institutions, schools. If you go to St. Cloud today, you will see two examples of it. The big prison just off of Highway 10 was built. The walls on the outside were built by the Works Progress Administration of the WPA. And many, many years ago, when I used to play football at St. Cloud State, we played at a place called Selke Field, which was about, 3/4 of a mile from the St. Cloud State campus. And that field has a huge wall around it, and that was also built by the Works Progress Administration. So a lot of different kind of public buildings were built by them. There's Huey Long. Paintings showing that there's still problems going on. The 1930s still has gangsters, still has other problems going on. Women began to break some gender barriers during this time. So we have a couple of women who are going to, essentially come on the scene. We have Ruth Benedict, who made strides in the fields of anthropology, moving forward as a scientist, and Pearl Buck, who wrote about Chinese peasant society and won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1938. They will also go on to hold positions in the federal government, including the president's cabinet. And so women, just shortly after getting the right to vote, are going to see a growth in their political power and influence. Eleanor Roosevelt. And if you look closely, you can see the beginning of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco there in the background. Cornerstone of the New Deal agency was the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA, designed to bring industries together to create a set of fair business practices. Working hours are reduced, so more people could be hired, minimum wage was established, and workers were given the right to organize. The NRA was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1935. All right, the NRA gave legislative powers to the president and allowed Congress to control individual businesses, not just interstate commerce. And that's the key right there. All right, the federal government had established the power to regulate interstate commerce, but not commerce that was taking place within a state. Public Works Administration was intended to provide long-term recovery. It was headed by Harold Ickes. The agency spent over $4 billion on thousands of projects, including public buildings, highways, and dams. And then ultimately, Congress will repeal prohibition with the 21st Amendment in late 1933. And also, they will start to tax alcohol and it will increase federal revenue. It also provides new forms of employment, getting people back to work. Many New Deal programs do not help minorities. TVA was the Tennessee Valley Authority, and they created a whole bunch of dams to provide hydroelectric power. And one of the lasting effects of the New Deal programs and second New Deal programs was to electrify the rural areas. So trying to bring electricity to people who didn't have it. Paying farmers not to farm, we've already kind of talked about this. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, trying to create parity for prices, trying to get farmers to set aside some of their land. Supreme Court ruled it was unconstitutional in 36, stating that its taxation programs were illegal. We talked about that a little bit earlier. There will be a second Agricultural Adjustment Act of 38 that continued conservation payments. If farmers obeyed acreage restrictions, they would be eligible for these payments. We see a version of this today in set-aside land that's used across the country, where farmers are paid by the government to not farm marginal land. And some of this comes out of, obviously, the Great Depression, but also the Dust Bowl that happens at the same time. We found out what happens when farmers try to farm all of the land and they don't leave anything left natural. And all across the plains, this was taking place. And when they went out of business and they didn't plant crops, that was wide open, barren fields, which led to the massive dust storms that are going to take place during the Depression. Dust bowls and black blizzards. That was a great segue into what we're going to take a look at here. Late in 1933, the Dust Bowl struck many states in the Trans-Mississippi Great Plains. You're going to hear a term called the Okies. It was Oklahoma. We're going to take a look at that here in a second. We're going to watch kind of a little intro. There's a really long documentary made by Ken Burns about the Dust Bowl. We're just going to watch a little 5-minute clip of it. It does a pretty good job of showing what it was all about. And you'll see there are a variety of different things that were put in place here to try to help farmers and to try to help, these Okies and Arkies. They'll have a variety of different names that they will call them. Crazy to think about how devastating the Dust Bowl could actually be and how strong those dust storms could be. It displaces a number of people, and it will change farming forever across the Great Plains. Here we can see people moving, packing up whatever possessions they have, and getting out any way they can. There's the areas that were affected, and you can kind of go through the map and see, here's where it was the most severe, the Panhandle region of Oklahoma, but spreads across essentially the entire plains. All right, battling bankers and big business. To protect the public against investment fraud, Congress passed the Truth and Securities Act. All right, the Federal Securities Act. It required people selling investments to provide full disclosure of information. And they also created the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, and provided oversight to the stock market. This was an attempt to try to stop people from overinflating the value of stocks. It's still in place today. We still have issues with it from time to time. Believe it or not, the Securities Exchange Commission actually sent Martha Stewart to jail about 8-9 years ago because she got insider information and was told that a report on a business was going to come out poorly and that the stock would most likely drop. And so she sold a bunch of her stock off before that happened. And now there's a couple of senators that might be in trouble with the Securities Exchange Commission as well. So it's still in effect today. It's meant to try to regulate the stock market and keep everything fair for everybody. TVA, I touched on it a little bit before. It's the Tennessee Valley Authority, designed to construct dams on the Tennessee River, in addition to providing employment and long-term recovery. It's often considered as the most socialistic because it's a government-run electric company, for lack of a better way of describing it, and ultimately it makes it very difficult for privately owned electric companies to try to compete with a government-owned electric company. So many people have considered the TVA the most socialistic program that is created during the New Deal, which is a time where there were a lot of social programs created. All right, here's a map of all the different dams that were created by the TVA, all the different power plants that were put up. This is the growth of the percentage of electrification, meaning getting electricity in the rural areas. So you can see it grew pretty dramatically and up to 100%. The Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA, was an attempt to improve the home building industry, gave small loans to homeowners for the purpose of improving their homes and buying new ones. FHA still exists today. The United States Housing Authority, passed in 1937, was designed to lend money to states or communities for low-cost housing developments, also still in existence today. All right, Social Security Act of 1935 provided federal state unemployment insurance to provide security for old age, economic, and other support for blind or disabled, and specified categories of retired workers or to receive regular payments from Washington. Everybody pays a Social Security tax today, and this is still in effect. The age range in which you can start to collect Social Security changes sometimes, but it is still a form of retirement payments, I guess, for lack of a better way of describing it. The purpose of Social Security was to provide support for urbanized Americans who could not support themselves with a farm. Prior to that, in these rural communities, as you got older, you tended to live with your children who worked on a farm, and they provided you with everything you needed. This was an attempt to not have those people become a burden, so to speak. And that's how many older people felt during the Depression, that they were unfairly burdening their families. And so this was an attempt to try to alleviate that. New Deal for Labor, the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. It's more commonly known as the Wagner Act. Very pro-union, I guess, for lack of a better way of describing it. Created a powerful National Labor Relations Board, which is still in effect today. Had the administrative purposes and reasserted the rights of labor to engage in self-organization and to bargain collectively through representatives of its own choice. The National Labor Relations Board still guides how contracts are negotiated between unions and companies. It's got a big, long list of rules for how things are supposed to go. And again, it's supposed to be meant to keep things fair between employees and employer. Unskilled workers began to organize under the leadership from John L. Lewis, boss of the United Mine Workers. He formed the Committee for Industrial Organization, the CIO. Eventually, the CIO will merge with the AFL to become the largest union in the country, known as the AFL-CIO. Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, Wages and Hours Bill in 1938. Industries involved in interstate commerce were to set up a minimum wage and maximum hour levels. Labor by children under the age of 16 was forbidden. And again, note that it says interstate commerce there, which allows Congress to have some control over it. In 1938, the CIO joined the AFL. The Committee for Industrial Organization was changed to the Congress of Industrial Organizations. CIO was led by Lewis. The goal of the CIO was the organization of all workers within industry. And by 1940, the CIO claimed about 4 million members. And like I said, as it merges together, it does become the largest union and still the largest union in this country. This is auto workers that have become unionized. This is another version of a strike known as a sit-down strike, where you literally go to work and you just sit down. And that stops all work or production. Organize, again, it's kind of what we consider propaganda, trying to get workers to unionize. Here you can see the percentage of employees that are unionized in the United States, still relatively low compared to other countries in the world. A lot of that is due to federal protections of workers, even if you're not in the union. Republicans are going to choose Alfred M. Landon to run against Roosevelt in the 1936 election. Obviously, he's not going to win. Democrats had significant support from millions of people, whether they were benefiting from the New Deal programs or they had hope in the New Deal programs. Roosevelt offered them hope. And so he is going to win in a landslide. And again, he appeals to the South, the blacks, the urbanites, and the poor. Although many of them aren't going to benefit from his programs, they thought they might. And so again, he's kind of selling the idea of hope. And in the 1940 election, World War II is on the horizon. It's happening over in Europe. And so Americans tend to almost always vote for the incumbent president during times of crisis. And so when he wins the 1936 election, it's almost a shoo-in he's going to win the 1940 election because of the trouble that looks like it's about to happen. Ratified in 1933, the 20th Amendment shortened the period from election to inauguration by 6 weeks. It used to be a pretty lengthy time from when you're actually elected until when you took the oath of office. So they shortened that up a little bit. Also, we move on here. In 1937, Roosevelt proposed legislation that would allow him to add liberal justices to the court. We talked about this a little bit earlier. And said a new justice would be added for every member over the age of 70 who would not retire. The plan received a whole bunch of negative feedback. It was known as a court packing plan. This was Roosevelt's attempt really to subvert checks and balances. So he was trying to essentially create, two branches of the government with the same line of thinking. So even though he was immensely popular, this is a really good thing by our country to not allow this to happen. So that's good. You want to keep checks and balances. Court's going to change course, possibly due to public pressure. The Supreme Court began to support New Deal legislation. This included Justice Owen J. Roberts, who was formerly regarded as a conservative. So there's public pressure to support what Roosevelt is trying, and there's also the pressure of trying to end the Depression. And one of the things that we haven't talked about yet, but we see it looks like the Depression is ending, and then it kind of comes back again. It's really up and down. And I think a lot of people across the country were desperate to try to find a way out of this situation. And so for whatever reason, they tend to, essentially kind of move in line with what Roosevelt was trying to do. A series of deaths and resignations of justices allowed Roosevelt to appoint 9 justices to the court. So he kind of gets his court packing plan anyways. Him and George Washington are the only two presidents to ever appoint all 9 justices to the Supreme Court. And obviously, Washington was, because he was the first one. So this is a political cartoon kind of making fun of the idea of the court packing plan. Roosevelt's first term from 33 to 37, again, elected in 32, and then the next election is in 36, but the inauguration takes place after that. Unemployment still ran high. Recovery had been slow. In 37, the economy took another downturn caused by reduced spending. So we talked about this a little bit already. This kind of looks like maybe the Depression is coming back. Shouldn't say coming back, but going to last longer. And so they're desperate to try to continue on with new programs. They're trying new things. The New Deal had run deficits for several years. All of them had been somewhat small, and a lot of it wasn't intended, and that's going to fall by the wayside. Downturn led FDR to embrace the recommendations of the British economist John Maynard Keynes. It's known as Keynesianism economics. I don't know. Mr. Guyan will be able to give you a much better explanation of what that is. But this policy intentionally creates a budget deficit. The result of this is that the national debt doubled in the 1930s. The idea is, again, to spread money throughout the economy so that the economy will kind of take off on its own. And then ultimately, then that money will end up coming back to the government and they can balance their budget. John Maynard Keynes is still highly regarded, I would say, as far as economics goes. And when you have Mr. Guyan next year and you talk about economics in much more detail, you'll be taking a look at this and what this idea is. Congress will pass the Hatch Act of 1939, prevented federal administrative officials from essentially from soliciting for money, I guess is the best way to try to describe that. There's the percentage of the workforce unemployed, again with the United States. Notice a rapid drop in Germany in 1932. All right, that's why I kept this chart on here. That's when Hitler comes to power. One of the things Hitler did is he promised to put people back to work, which of course he did illegally by expanding the size of the military greatly. So we should have been able to see it coming. And then the index of industrial production. And again, you see Germany there kind of surpassing everybody as they're going to massively ramp up their industrial production leading up to World War II. New Deal or Raw Deal? Increase in the national debt from 32 to 39. The national debt increased from 19 trillion to 40 trillion. Federal government became much more powerful under FDR, probably the most powerful it has been. The New Deal did not end the Depression. It just gave temporary relief to citizens. Many economists eventually argued that not enough deficit spending was used. Despite the New Deal program efforts, production still outpaced spending, which means there's a surplus of products, which again isn't good for industry because it drives the price down. And if it's driving the price down, then industry can't afford to pay its workers. And so it's kind of this double-edged sword, so to speak. Not until World War II will we be able to solve the unemployment problem. And when World War II starts, there's no more problems of unemployment. So we still see unemployment lines. And again, minorities are usually hit worse by this. The balance sheet here. Essentially what we're trying to go through here is the New Deal supporters had argued out that relief, not the economy, was the primary objective because that's what was working. People were getting relief, but the economy wasn't really rebounding. FDR potentially saved capitalism by eliminating some of its worst faults, like poor labor conditions. Has programs not been implemented, socialism could have taken a bigger hold in the nation. That's speculation because socialism was taking hold in other countries around the world to a much greater extent than what it was here. FDR was a Hamiltonian in that he supported big government, but he was kind of a Jeffersonian in that he supported the forgotten man. So he's kind of a little of both there. All right, so Roosevelt's steering the ship, trying to get us out of the Depression through recovery for the American people. And obviously, we have our detractors in the background. There is the chronology of events, and therefore the end of this presentation.